All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Inside at Sacred Trust. You know, we've got we saw that the radar was showing the cell to come in here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we don't want Dr. Nunley to have the experience of running in here with all the rest of us. Some of us had to do that last year. Who was with us when we had to do that? All right, so we threw Gary Edelman out of the tent and had to bring him in here. We were not going to do that to Dr. Nunley. So we thought that we ought to move her inside, and then my program at 3 o'clock will also be in this room. So we're very fortunate and honored to have her with us today. The topic that she's going to deal with, enslaved women and capital crime, this is a place to discuss these topics. We're sitting on the greatest battle of the American Civil War, fought 160 years ago. People fought and died for these issues, and this is going to be a great talk to continue our education related to the Civil War. There's a big Civil War out there, everybody, and it's got a lot of ramifications both before, during, and after the Civil War. The consequences, the causes of the war, the conduct of the war, all of these things are important here, and at the Gettysburg Foundation, we want to make sure we explore all of these things. So on behalf of the National Park Service, our partner here, and us, we're so glad that she is with us. So I'm going to read a little bit and then tell you a little bit about her. Demonstrating how crimes, convictions, and clemency function within a slave society that have upheld the property interests of white Virginians. Dr. Nunley reveals the frequency with which owners preferred to keep the accused in bondage, which allowed them behind the veil of paternalism to continue to benefit from black women's labor. The so-called clemency also sought to rob black women of the power they exercised when they committed capital crimes. The testimonies that Dr. Nunley has collected and analyzed offer compelling glimpses of self-identities forged by black women as they attempted to resist enslavement and the limits of justice available to them in the Antebellum courtroom. Dr. Nunley is Associate Professor of History and the Sandler Family Faculty Fellow of the Americana Studies at Cornell University. So she's all the way from New York to be with us today. Along with the articles, essays, and reviews she has authored At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., which received the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Award, and the Pauli Murray Book Prize, the Mary Kelley Book Prize. Wow, that's a lot of prizes. Her article, Thrice Condemned, Enslaved Women, Violence, and Practice of Leniency in the Antebellum Courts, received the Letitia Woods Brown Prize for Best Article in African American Women History, and the Anne Braden Prize for Best Article in Southern Women's History. So, wow, what a resume, huh? And we're so honored to have her with us today at the Gettysburg Foundation here at Gettysburg. Welcome, Dr. Tamika Nunley. Thank you. And a beautiful family up front. I'm sorry. A beautiful family up here, too, as well.
Thank you so much. My 1-year-old might introduce herself with her own acts of insurgency today. So if you hear a little uprising, at the front, don't worry. She has someone to escort her out. Thank you so much, Wayne, and also Tammy, thank you so much for organizing the logistics and for the Gettysburg Foundation for having me. This is such a special place. The last time I was here was in 2018. I was leading a bike tour through Gettysburg, through the Shenandoah Valley, to Antietam, and then to Harper's Ferry in 3 days. And I'd like to add that I'm not a biker. And the last time I was on a bike prior to that trip, I was 12 years old in a peach-colored Huffy bicycle with streamers on the side. So you can imagine what kind of trip it was and what kind of lectures I gave under duress. So I'm happy to be in the air conditioning today and to not be on a bike, but excited nonetheless to be at this wonderful place that has really captured beautifully just this rich history that people continue to be fascinated by, including myself. I've always been interested in the Civil War. I'm a military brat. Everyone in my family has served in the military since the American Civil War, and so it's just been really a privilege to be able to do this work. And so today I'm actually going to share a little bit more about how enslaved women actually experienced the Civil War in Virginia. And this is sort of based off of my most recent book, The Demands of Justice. And today I just wanted to sort of share some of the stories and less of the sort of legal jargon that oftentimes fills these kinds of publications. And so I'll go ahead and begin. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Okay, so on the morning of Monday, May 6, 1861, Agnes, a 16-year-old girl, escaped from a man who hired her for the year. Agnes made this prodigious decision right at the beginning of the war, at a time of grave uncertainty concerning the possible outcomes of the conflict. The subscriber warned that, quote, "The law will be enforced in such cases." However, slaveholders knew that a groundswell of resistance became a possibility, given the geographic proximity of the theaters of war and enemy lines. Agnes, a young girl with a whole life ahead of her, should the escape lead her out of the grips of slavery, sought freedom. She stepped out in search for a new way of life and acted upon the idea that she should be free. But even as the runaway notice appeared in a small box, lost amidst notices for spring and summer supply of books and stationery and the sale of 3 young mares, few might notice that Agnes legally belonged to none other than the revered general of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee. As he corralled Southern soldiers in the Eastern theater of the war, Agnes slipped away. The actions taken by enslaved women show how their insurgent behavior preceded the legal end of slavery. These stories remind us that by the end of the Civil War, enslaved people set in motion a series of rejoinders reminiscent of the battles they fought in the decades leading up to the conflict. Historian Vincent Brown argued that the slave trade catalyzed ongoing warfare, and although his work attends to the 18th century, the same might also hold true for the antebellum South. Brown asserts that, quote, "This is not a war in a conventional sense, however, involving disciplined armies directed by rulers of states. Rather, it was the simmering violence inherent in mastery, by its nature of forceful assault and the slave's countervailing resentment of slaveholders' fraud, rapine, and cruelty," end quote. Stephanie Camp reminds us in Closer to Freedom that enslaved women engaged in everyday acts of resistance that preceded wartime actions waged against their former owners. And in Virginia, this fact also holds true. Thavolia Glimpf offers that, quote, "Slave resistance, the burning of planter homes, attempted murders, conspiracies, and flight, confirmed how much enslaved people knew and understood about the conflict and put their experience as knowledge brokers to new use," end quote. Manifestations of enslaved women's acts of urgency revealed their anti-slavery and liberation politics. The Civil War allowed for them to act on stores of knowledge, memory, and strategies of resistance passed down and developed over time and geography. These tactics were not novel. Indeed, they appeared repeatedly throughout the decades leading up to the war. The story of the enslaved women that follow reveal the ways that they became the knowledge brokers that Thavolia Glimpf speaks of, through attempted murder, conspiracies, arson, and flight. Irreparable political divisions brought the South to warfare, and Virginia became part of a different kind of insurgency, one that protected the rights of the Commonwealth and the institution of slavery. Like previous conflicts where the military fought on North American soil, enslaved people took advantage of the conditions of war to reach lines of refuge and possible opportunities for freedom. The war, however, created the kinds of conditions that slaveholders always threatened and feared. Threats of secession became reality once Southern states established a new government. And the fear of warfare between seceded states and the Union, slaveholders and the enslaved, became an increasingly conceivable danger to the stability of this new government. Stealth attempts to remind slaveholders of their own vulnerability impacted the health, happiness, and property that shaped the power dynamics of slaveholders and slave societies. With a few exceptions, most historical accounts of the wartime experiences of the enslaved emphasize the accounts of men arriving to Union lines to avail themselves to the military in hopes for freedom and wages in exchange. But what exists in the record reveal the many ways enslaved women, too, leveraged the conditions of war to abandon farms, burn houses, take food, and begin life anew. Insurgency swelled at the most opportune moments. Virginia newspapers reveal how slaveholders continued to act as though slavery remained firmly intact and had every reason to believe this at the beginning of the war. They submitted their notices of runaways, advertisements of enslaved people for sale or available for hire, and local municipalities adhered to the pre-war customs that governed slavery in the face of unionist measures. In 1863, an advertisement for a girl for hire between the age of 12 and 14 became available for the balance of the year, but only within Confederate territory. In the midst of warfare, a girl as young as 12 might continue to experience the displacement of slave hiring within the Commonwealth. The enduring operation of pre-war financial transactions that shifted the lives of enslaved girls, coupled with the exigencies of war, meant that they were often forced to confront profound levels of uncertainty, especially as many of the girls were hired away from kin. Presumably, the owner of the girl believed his property rights to be protected under the laws of the new government. But enforcement proved difficult as the war made increasing demands on men used to police the enslaved. Moreover, Union policies threatened the stability of slavery within the Confederacy as martial law made possible the legal emancipation of the enslaved who resided in the seceded territories. For Virginians, however, joining the CSA made the laws of the Union null and void. The enslaved women who escaped were not refugees, but in the eyes of the Confederate government, they were fugitives. As historian Crystal Feimster also reminds us, even escape to Union lines did not ensure an enslaved girl's safety, as they might also face vulnerability to physical and sexual violence. Enslaved women absconded from the plantations and households of slaveholders and Virginians who hired enslaved people under a contract that stipulated a specific term of service. Escape, then, did not simply occur in a linear fashion that led women from these homes directly to Union lines or to the north. Depending on their location, they might leave and head towards other parts of Virginia in order to connect with children, partners, and other kin. Others left within cities and towns such as Richmond, Norfolk, Alexandria, and Petersburg by folding their lives into the vibrant community of free and enslaved Virginians who lived separate from white families. Some women, however, did set their sights on searching for refuge within Union military encampments. Regardless of the destination, enslaved women leveraged the conditions of war that demanded the mobilization of white men, who typically provided surveillance for the behavior, movement, and labor of the enslaved. As the Confederacy stood in need of filling the ranks of an unprecedented army and the western half of the state remained loyal to the Union, the Commonwealth changed indefinitely and thus redefined the political geography of insurgency for the enslaved. Virginia shifted from a haven of the Old South and a symbol of stability to a place of both mutability and vulnerability. Enslaved women, just as they did with the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, knew that this was a moment in which they set their claims to freedom in motion. The escapes of enslaved women sent ruptures throughout the South as slaveholders struggled to maintain control of the enslaved population while trying to mobilize resources and military support for the Confederate cause. As historian Thavolia Glimp so aptly argues, the resistance and actions of enslaved women reflect their political commitments. She states, quote, "In refugee camps and on plantations, Black women sharpened the politics of freedom born in slavery," end quote. The politics of enslaved women and girls manifested within the context of their disenfranchisement and the economic inhibitions that came with being Black, female, and enslaved in the American South. Nevertheless, they mobilized a politics that emphasized their entitlements to freedom and acted upon their own articulations of justice, premised by the idea that slavery and all that they endured was wrong. Enslaved women and girls also became political actors by virtue of the ways their actions impacted the war, exposed slaveholders, and shaped meanings of freedom and justice. As Agnes's story reminds us, both slaveholders and renters of the enslaved lost returns on their economic investments in the labor of enslaved people during the war when they fled. Jenny escaped from a Mrs. Hagan who resided near Mayo Street in Richmond and hired her from her owner. At 40 years old, Jenny could sense that the war made the possibilities of life in Virginia different from anything she had ever witnessed. Indeed, countless women like her never made it to Union lines, but fled within cities nearby instead. Such a decision made by a woman of her experience might lead to more promising employment prospects. Even in the Confederacy and in similar instances of escape prior to the war, enslaved women absconded within southern cities and made attempts to hire themselves out. Union lines did not serve as the only destination for enslaved women who escaped. The possibility of blending within communities of free or hired Black residents who lived apart from slave owners allowed opportunities to remain hidden in plain sight. Some believe they spotted Jenny at the Exchange Hotel located at the southwest corner of Franklin and 14th Streets, where, quote, she is no doubt hiring herself somewhere in the city, end quote. Histories of slave escapes often point to the lower numbers of enslaved women who fled compared to that of enslaved men and boys. The archival record shows that this fact holds true during the war, since many of the men fled to serve in the Union military. In the women's fight, Glymph offers that, quote, the number of Black women and children fugitives grew with the mobilization of Black men as soldiers and laborers in the Union Army, end quote. Similarly, enslaved women took flight with children in tow or in search of children who resided on separate but local plantations. Just as soon as Benjamin Rose purchased Lucinda, a, quote, medium-sized woman of copper color, and her daughter Clara, a girl with white hair and blue eyes, end quote, they were both gone. They were recently hired out to the overseer that supervised the estate belonging to the Bricker family of Culpeper County just after they were purchased. The Brickers also hired Lucinda's husband, but he did not appear in the escape notice. This doesn't mean, however, that he didn't escape or possess plans to. Just below the notice of Lucinda and Clara's escape, 20-year-old Dick left a slaveholder donning a, quote, blue Yankee uniform, quote, coat, end quote. The advertisement, listed just before the one that featured them, alerted readers of the escape of a young man who is, quote, no doubt making his way to federal lines, end quote. We also don't know if the couple decided to part ways, as many enslaved people did following the war. Furthermore, it is unclear as to whether or not Lucinda's husband fathered Clara, since the advertisement described her as having blonde hair and blue eyes. The prospect of freedom meant that the enslaved acted on their desires to choose for themselves, partners, and other significant details pertaining to life after slavery. Similarly, Betty left Joseph Davis, the man who hired her from the slaveholder who owned her. She left Davis's homestead and made her way to Cumberland County, where her children remained held in bondage. Tempe escaped from a property located near Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond. Her owner suspected that she planned to head toward Goochland County to reunite with her husband. Enslaved women used the years of the war to plot their futures and made important decisions about where they planned to go and who to take with them. Enslaved women in Virginia created their own rituals of freedom, including the adoption of preferred names and surnames, choices of dress and manners. Winnie Morton escaped on the morning of July 3rd, 1862, just before Independence Day and right on the heels of General Lee's successful defense against the invading Union Army in the 7 Days battles. The Army of Northern Virginia managed to stave off McClellan's campaign, but the war within the Commonwealth waged on as women like Winnie Morton slipped from the watchful eye of slaveholders. Most runaway notices included the first name of an enslaved person, but in this case, Winnie appears with a last name, likely a surname she insisted to be referred by. In addition to wearing a, quote, black silk handkerchief and a hooded bonnet, she appeared very, quote unquote, ladylike. Perhaps she planned to head in the direction of Manchester, where her sister resided, or meet up with her husband, who waits upon a Captain Sales in the Army. Mary Jane, described as a, quote, small, delicate-featured woman of a dark gingerbread color, also escaped from Joseph Jackson, the man who hired her in Richmond. As I've shown in earlier scholarship, enslaved women engaged in their own processes of self-making, even as slavery and racial inequality circumscribed the possibilities of these rituals. Falling somewhere between the age of 20 and 25 years old, Mary Jane, quote, calls herself Mary Jane Jackson and generally dresses in black, end quote. When 19th century women in America wore black, the choice of color typically signaled a state of mourning. However, when we consider the creativity of enslaved women, we must ponder alternative meanings assigned to sartorial choices, names, decisions, etc. Even as the subscriber might express reluctance to take seriously Mary Jane Jackson's appointed dress and surname, they understood the necessity of acknowledging these choices in order to strengthen the chances of her retrieval. Enslaved women looked to kin and community to assist with wartime escapes and provide much needed support to evade slave traders commissioned to find them. In the spring of 1862, Daphne, a 30-year-old woman purchased by Nathaniel Tyler of Richmond, escaped from his household. He described her as tall and black with a high forehead and made a point to explain that he viewed her as, quote unquote, quite good looking. The explicit mention of this in the advertisement reveals the scope of surveillance slave catchers employed to prey on the enslaved women on the run. The sexualized tenor of the advertisement did not appear uncommon or unsavory for a city known for funneling scores of attractive enslaved women into sexualized bondage. Perhaps this description might offer a window into what she experienced with slavery in Richmond, but the advertisement and record does not go into such detail. 18-year-old Cora fled from a slaveholder who described her appearance as, quote, a gingerbread color, full face, thick lips, having the appearance of being swollen, a remarkably nice figure, end quote. These descriptions, while designed to increase the effectiveness of reconnaissance, drew attention to the bodies of enslaved women that projected sexualized desires and predatory innuendo as a part of surveillance in retrieving women runaways. These discreet yet public understandings of the forced intimacies that slaveholders demanded were both widely and tacitly accepted. If enslaved women were fortunate enough to maintain some proximity to kin, they might temporarily or permanently abscond. He noted that, quote, she has a sister living on Franklin Street below Johnson's livery stable, revealing the ways that slaveholders took extra care to decipher important relations among the enslaved. Tyler instructed those who discovered her whereabouts to secure her in jail owned by a prominent slave trader, Hector Davis. Hector Davis welcomed handsome profits that exceeded many of the returns from area crop yields. He did the dirty work of hunting and selling the enslaved while slaveholders filled his coffers in return. He became so prosperous that he served as the president of Traders Bank, an institution that he helped charter. His ability to find an attractive runaway would not be difficult given his own affinity for Black women. He fathered a number of children with an enslaved woman, Anne Banks Davis, who he made arrangements to be sent to Philadelphia by the time the notice of Daphne's escape appeared. Davis died during the war not long after the advertisement appeared. His death and the accumulating misfortune that slaveholders experienced as the war raged on created critical opportunities for bondwomen. Some women and girls escaped while fighting off diseases and physical obstacles to their plans to flee. Parthena escaped right at the beginning of the war, wearing, quote, a dark brown and white calico dress and described as medium-sized and of a gingerbread color. The subscriber also instructed those searching for her to look for a shortened forefinger on the right hand, a result of a painful infection of the finger known as whitlow, a type of herpes simplex virus. Slaveholders made note of particular physical attributes that underscore the range of challenges that enslaved women and girls learned to navigate in the absence of therapeutic treatment, medical care, and resources. 19-year-old Hannah did not let anything get in the way of her plans to escape from Dinwiddie County. If freedom became a viable possibility, a young woman of her age had years to look forward to that didn't involve her remaining in bondage. The subscriber explained that Hannah spoke with a stammer, particularly when excited, but this did not pose a barrier to her making her way to Union lines, as her owner suspected. Millie, at just 14 years of age, appeared particularly determined to escape. She appeared in the notice as having gingerbread color, full head of hair, quote, not quite recovered from a severe spell of sickness, end quote. Her case is remarkable not only for the relatively young age at which she fled, but also because she ran with her legs chained with an 8-pound ball fastened to it. The advertisement tells the reader more about the conditions of her bondage and the kinds of treatment she experienced than it reveals about her whereabouts. The women fleeing bondage within and beyond Virginia sought freedom along pathways that allowed them to live economically viable lives. Owners struggled to trace their steps as they understood firsthand the intellectual capacities of these women, even as they attempted to downplay them. Martha, a woman described as approximately 45 years old, of gingerbread color, flat face, quote, with bad teeth, of ordinary size, but remarkably shrewd, end quote. The subscriber remarks how her astute quality might position her to be rather cunning, but what we might also glean from this observation is the ways that her ability to think strategically and intelligently worked to mobilize her own efforts to realize freedom. These qualities that might threaten the ability of slave traders and bounty hunters to discern the whereabouts and maneuvers of the enslaved appear within the same newspaper. Just before the advertisement for Martha appears, one for Adeline alerts readers to her escape from a plantation in Chesterfield County. For the slaveholder to understand Adeline is to not only take note of her medium size and gingerbread color, but her quote-unquote genteel appearance. Gentility, a term with origins in Virginia dating back to the 18th century, defined a class of people emerging in the colony as purveyors of taste and refinement. The enslaver's use of the term to offer a portrait of Adeline suggests that self-making occurred well before emancipation, as she made particular choices about her disposition that led locals to understand her as someone known for cultivated deportment and sophistication. In Martha's case, the slaveholder suspected that, quote, she is most likely in Richmond, passing herself off as a free Negro washer and ironer, end quote. Not only did he fear that he'd lost her, but he knew that she could pull it off. Similarly, Nancy, a 25-year-old woman, quote, apparently left home without cause, although bondage proved to be a sufficient cause and home an unfitting term for what enslaved women experienced in Virginia households. He too suspected that Nancy worked, quote, about town in the capacity of a washwoman, end quote. Sylvie, a 20-year-old woman, escaped within Richmond, and her owner told those on the lookout to take note of her, quote, pleasurable manners. Emma, a quote-unquote mulatto girl, about 5 feet 2 inches in height with tolerably straight hair, escaped from her owner, who attests that she, quote, falsely pretends to be a free woman, end quote. These qualities assisted the women in their efforts to secure employment, making freedom more tenable than if they were not to demonstrate these shrewd qualities. Black women perceived by whites to be smart triggered much aggravation among slaveholders in search of their whereabouts. Harriet, known for her abilities to cook, escaped Richmond, likely with the intentions of hiring herself out as a free cook. She likely developed a reputation for doing things on her terms, especially given the rather vivid description of her in a runaway advertisement. The subscriber described Harriet as, quote, a bright, thin-breasted, tall, sneaking mulatto, end quote. Most threatening to those in search of her was the fact that she knew how to read. Her literacy put her in a position to forge necessary documents, make contracts with potential employers, and serve as an asset to members of her community. Adding to the frustration of the slaveholder, he added that Harriet, quote, is a Methodist, sings very loud, and is disposed to argue, end quote. She wore a red bodice, black skirt, and a colored straw bonnet adorned with blue ribbons. Enslaved women possessed thoughts, desires, and methods for presenting themselves that confounded slaveholders. Donning a red bodice, she might quickly revert from singing a spirited hymn to inflicting you with her sharp tongue. As the war progressed, enslaved women and girls in Virginia made plans to venture beyond the state, with some buying some time within the city until they could find their way to other places. Sarah left with the man who owned her, quote, possibly making an effort to escape to the Yankees, or it may be that she is lurking about the city to pass as free, end quote. During the later years of the war, some women didn't have a clear sense of where they might escape to, but the city and its changing population of soldiers, migrants, and refugees meant that Richmond allowed them connections with people who might share ideas and strategies for life beyond Virginia. For those on the lookout, the subscriber instructed them to look for a 22-year-old woman, quote, stout-built, of gingerbread color. Margaret wore a green dress when she left the person who claimed ownership of her. The subscriber suspected that, quote, she may endeavor to make her way to North Carolina or Tennessee. Women like Margaret might set their sights on places like North Carolina or Tennessee, perhaps to follow the Union Army or to find kin. Unlike the antebellum era, enslaved women and girls who escaped during the war might target different destinations that did not always set them on the route towards the northern states. As it became increasingly clear that the Union made headway in the war, some women boldly escaped with and towards loved ones. 2 women, Millie and Hannah, escaped from their owner along with one 12-year-old boy and 4 girls at the ages of 2, 6, 8, and 10 years old. With young children, the group might easily be detected, but the chaos of war and the spread of new information about the Confederate forces being pulled into more conflicts than they possessed the manpower to defend led many women with kin and children to take the next steps to seek new homes and lives. Kitty and Ben escaped together from the household their owner hired them out to in Fluvanna County. Similar in age and owned by the same person, the pair likely headed to Goochland County, where Ben's mother lived. Kinship and connections drove thousands of enslaved people to different parts of the South, where they searched for those from whom they were separated prior to the war. Barbara left at the age of 40 with the intention to return to New Kent, where she came from prior to being forced under the custody of the subscriber. Lucinda left the household of her owner in Henrico County, probably with plans to head to Mechanicsville in Hanover County, where her family raised her. Jim and Ellen escaped together, likely towards Culpeper County, where they maintained relations. the owner caught wind of their intentions by a simple assessment of what they took with them. Jim, a young man about 25 years old, likely escaped before he spent time in the Army. The subscriber warned that Jim, quote, will try to pass himself off as the servant of an officer, end quote. In addition to his military experience, Jim carried with him, quote, cavalry boots, a soldier's cap faced with red, a slouch hat, gray overcoat, a blue cloth military frock coat, and blankets, end quote. Ellen did not leave empty-handed either. Described as rather good-looking, she intended to stay that way, taking with her a plaid dress, black calico, a hood, and blankets. Ellen, however, left her child at the homestead of her owner, which he hoped might, quote, induce her to stop and see it, end quote. In measures considered both significant and trivial, the thousands of enslaved people within the Commonwealth did their part to shape the outcome of their own lives, and thus the war itself. In the Confederate capital, Lavinia, an enslaved woman documented as the property of Martha Hill, stood trial for burning Hill's residence. Locals ran towards the large 4-story brick dwelling to put out the flames that not only threatened to destroy any evidence of the structure, but the neighboring edifices as well. As witnesses approached the house, they noticed 4 simultaneous fires dancing throughout the first and second floors. Martha Hill was not present when the fires started because she promenaded about the city to visit acquaintances. With the house left in Lavinia's care, witnesses questioned where the keys to the rest of the doorways in the house could be found. Lavinia responded that the keys remained tucked away in her pocket, which meant that those attempting to extinguish the fire broke several doors just to get to the damaged areas. Lavinia remained in control, appearing and disappearing, to observe the progress of the fire while also withholding her assistance. Witnesses deposed testified that prior to the incident and around the time of the death of Alexander Hill, Martha's husband, that they noticed a quote-unquote marked difference in Lavinia's conduct. Not long before the fire, Lavinia attempted to escape from Martha, a mistress who now wielded unchecked authority over her after her husband died. Lucy and William, 2 enslaved people who worked in the Hill household, notified a neighbor who summoned the firemen. One door remained unlocked, but others required the keys from Lavinia. One witness testified that they couldn't find Lavinia when the firemen arrived, but after he extinguished the basement flames, she noticed her standing among the crowd. Lavinia, quote, had entire charge of the house, and the keys were in her pocket, end quote, Lucy testified. Mrs. Mary Arnold, likely an acquaintance of Martha Hill, left trunks containing clothing, linens, and money at Hill's home. She informed the court that the fire damaged one of the trunks, but the remaining items were discovered in Lavinia's room, which included items such as a skirt and $25 that belonged to Arnold. Hill, however, stated that she, quote, always treated the prisoner kindly and had no cause to suspect that the prisoner would fire the house, end quote. Lavinia's resolve seemed clear and did not confess to any wrongdoing. Enslaved women in the capital felt the rumblings of war and leveraged these conditions to act in ways that appeared out of character for those who knew them years prior to the war. Celia, an enslaved woman bound with her daughter to Charles Palmer of Richmond, became known for being, quote, obedient and well-behaved always, end quote. She gained a good reputation she cultivated for many years, but by the time of the war, something had happened. One morning, when Sally Law, the mistress of the household, left the house under Celia's charge, she could not anticipate what awaited her upon her return. Likely hired out to Theodore Law and his wife, Palmer ensured the Laws of Celia's good name. When they returned, they noticed the front door ajar, a door they distinctly remembered having locked. The Laws questioned Celia about the door, and she appeared, quote unquote, very much confused. Theodore Law headed towards the basement to ensure that there were no burglars lurking in hiding. As he inspected the premises, Law noticed the smell of smoke billowing through the bedroom door. Once he broke the door down, the house rapidly filled with smoke, but he couldn't help noticing the bursar, which someone pried open and set fire. As Theodore and local police and neighbors attempted to put the fire out, they set out to exit through the back door, but the door was locked. When they called for Celia, she again appeared, quote, very much confused and brought the wrong key, end quote. Celia initially denied any knowledge of the fire and robbery, and when the court deposed Sally Law, she corroborated the account provided by her husband, but managed to include additional details about her interactions with Celia. As the flames roared throughout her home, Sally entreated Celia to assist with the effort to put the fire out by bringing buckets of water to the second floor of the house. Celia, again, appeared quite confused and state that she, quote, did not know where the buckets were, end quote, leading Sally to fetch them herself. Sally testified that Celia, quote, had been a very good servant and she had no cause to complain of her, end quote. Celia confessed to the act, and the police officer searched for any missing property and discovered $3,820 hidden in Celia's stocking. In the chimney, the police discovered 2 missing watches along with jewelry. Tried, convicted, and found guilty, Celia received a sentence of 39 lashes administered immediately. Another 39 lashes received the following Saturday in transportation away from Virginia. Where she ended up is unclear, but her owner went to great lengths to explain her history of good behavior. Even Sally testified that Celia gave her no problems during the time that she worked in the household. But the Confederacy was at war. Resources proved increasingly scarce, and perhaps Celia's survival no longer hinged upon her agreeable behavior, and instead she saw another future on the horizon. Enslaved people throughout the war showed visible signs of restlessness, finding opportunities for refusal that came with wartime conditions. As the threat of emancipation loomed large in the deliberations of Confederate officials, the need to maintain control on the home front, particularly with regard to preserving slavery in the South, became a priority. Confederates straddled the competing demands of demonstrating a firm and convincing sense of intolerance towards resistance of the enslaved, and the need to protect the economic value of the enslaved and the financial interests of slaveholders. The disruptions of war and the demands of establishing a legitimate nation state meant that the sentencing practices of the courts remained unpredictable. On December 3, 1862, Margaret faced murder charges for the death of Frances Dean Tardy, the infant belonging to Samuel Tardy. Like countless enslaved women, Margaret served as the nurse to the child, a responsibility that might involve wet nursing, regular care such as bathing, clothing, and feeding the child, while also tending to the child when they fell ill. An enslaved woman deposed as a witness testified that she heard groans from the child near the privy and that, quote, the child was very bloody, and Margaret seemed to be blowing the child in the face, end quote. She also observed that the child seemed, quote, perfectly well and healthy prior to Margaret's trip to the privy. She noticed Margaret giving the child air through the mouth, and Margaret explained that she believed the child experienced a spasm or seizure. The Tardys sent for Dr. Phillips, who found the child suffering from, quote, violent convulsions with blood about the mouth and a bruise on the forehead. While the skin did not appear broken, the doctor observed several bruises that appeared on the ears, temples, forehead, and hip of the child. He believed that the child died of, quote, compression of the brain, but noticed that there was every indication that violence had been inflicted on the child, end quote. Another doctor followed up with a second examination and testified that he noticed blood in the child's mouth along with bruises on the head. While the Tardys' older twins suffered from convulsions, the doctor explained that, quote, the convulsions of the deceased were not such as are produced by disease, but were such as are produced by violence, end quote. The court found Margaret guilty of murder in the first degree. Just days after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Margaret died on the gallows in the Confederate capital. The court tried a case involving Eliza, an enslaved woman accused of administering laudanum to Augustus Cupper, the child belonging to Frederick Cupper, for whom she worked. Frederick Swift claimed ownership of Eliza and likely hired her out to the Cuppers. The issues central to cases such as these focused on the intent to kill qualifier of the charge, particularly those involving substances such as laudanum, which enslaved nurses and white mothers typically gave infants to address ailments and distress. The record, hastily written, indicates that Eliza was discharged with no evidence or testimony referred to in the deliberations. The infant survived the incident, and given the common practice of administering laudanum and subsequently the harmful side effects of the treatment, the court likely decided that the case did not warrant the sentences typically executed in infanticide cases. Some incidents did not reflect acts of insurgency, but certainly stoked the fires of vulnerability and alarm that made them conscious of an enemy within. As Virginians struggled to protect the Commonwealth, they made painstaking efforts to build. In February of 1864, Fanny, an enslaved woman on the estate belonging to John Carey, must have heard news from afar of the developments of the war. The court fixed her value at $800, and this was no small figure in antebellum or wartime terms. But in the CSA, this amount was particularly significant, if not inflated. Moreover, just as Washington, D.C. was the citadel of the Union, Richmond, where Fanny lived, became the stronghold of the Confederacy. She undoubtedly learned of the advances made by Lee's army, the strategic gains at the beginning of the war, and the losses that smattered throughout in neighboring battles. Word of emancipation in the District of Columbia certainly spread among enslaved women in Richmond, and yet they waited in the grip of bondage where the laws of the antebellum era remained, and the demands of labor were ever present in their day-to-day lives. In 1864, emancipatory transformation seemed to unfold everywhere but Richmond, and much to John Kerry's dismay, Fanny set one of the buildings on his estate on fire. Arson occurred regularly before the war, but at the time when locals struggled to overcome increasingly depleted resources, Fanny's alleged actions exacerbated existing tensions within the Confederacy. Her testimony is absent in the historical record, but we can infer a number of motivations. To begin, it is possible that Fanny was not the culprit, or if she was, it was an accident. The scholarship on slave resistance, however, confirms the persistence of intentional acts of arson committed by enslaved people, particularly during times of war. While Virginia courts had a history of issuing clemency in cases where the governor deemed appropriate, more measures such as lashes and labor on the public works became a possible outcome geared toward protecting the property that remained. In Fanny's case, however, the court sentenced her to sale and transportation beyond the limits of the CSA. And so interestingly, the state penitentiary purchased Fanny at the sum of $800, and she remained there for the duration of the war. Fanny's experience was neither defined by flight or a willingness to remain, but revealed the ways in which enslaved women might find themselves confined within the bastion of the Confederacy with limited recourse beyond geographically contained retaliation. Later that same year, the governor did commute the sentence of an enslaved woman accused of arson. Jane, an enslaved woman in Goochland County, pled not guilty to setting ablaze the dwelling home of her owner, Charles Woodson, and subsequently received a sentence of death by hanging. The governor, however, commuted the sentence to sale and transportation outside of the limits of the CSA. And the penitentiary in Virginia purchased Jane at the sum of $2,000, which is not completely surprising given the currency inflation that comes as a result of the close of the war. By 1864, enslaved women learned how wartime legislation freed thousands of former slaves and how Union armies increasingly encroached upon Southern territories and brought news of emancipation. But for these women, who lived within the final stronghold of Lee's army and the seat of the Confederate government, freedom did not appear within reach, even if it did in view. Fanny and Jane's experiences illuminate the ways that reactions to the war could be circumscribed by varying conditions of the war and legal customs of sovereign nations, which were complex in and of themselves. It is no coincidence that Sherman's march was a proliferation of acts of arson as the soldiers scorched the most vital parts of the South. This was a tactic stealthily wielded by the enslaved for centuries prior to the American Civil War. This quick and destructive act became the new military strategy of the Union Army that served multiple purposes, including the ruin of significant structures that were vital to everyday life in the South, but also the value lost in property from eliminating access to estates, the supplies, furniture, crops, and most importantly, the enslaved. With each wave of arson and rampage came the looming reality of what it would take to rebuild the South. And along the way, enslaved people did their part to contribute to these losses. They acted with their feet and their willingness to deploy some of the warfare tactics they learned from surviving the violence of slavery many decades prior to the firing at Fort Sumter. Right off the heels of Sherman's march and just north of the James River, within a mile of the city of Richmond, Vina and Mary were guided by a white person who helped them maneuver through the picket lines of Confederate military encampments near Richmond. In Henrico County, Union forces assembled with plans to build the momentum generated by Sherman's army. In the frigid conditions of Virginia in early January, the women made their way to Union lines. John Holstead claimed ownership of Vina, and Catherine Gamble likewise claimed Mary as her property. Much to their consternation, the women left with the aid of Anne Perrin, a white woman to whom Mary and Vina paid with a silk dress and a set of 6 silver spoons for her assistance. Once they arrived at Anne Perrin's home, a free black man who went by the name of Childress took the women, quote, about 2.5 miles from the city where they went to the enemy, end quote. The court accused Anne of, quote, advising and convincing the women to escape to Union lines. But it is also possible that the women devised the plans themselves, and Anne appeared as a willing accomplice in exchange for the items that she received. These were desperate times in the Confederacy, particularly for white women left on the home front with deteriorating resources as a result of the financial toll of the war. Officials arrested Anne along with Mary, who was caught. According to Holstead, Vina, quote, made her escape and has never been heard of since she left, end quote. Warfare shaped the contours of resistance that enslaved women and girls deployed against their former owners in order to walk into new possibilities. The promise that the Confederate government could protect the property of slaveholders proved to be one critical failure among many in the new nation. Enslaved women and girls, however, quickly became students of the possibilities and opportunities presented by the war. They acted upon their own politics and on the understanding that slavery produced a society rife with injustice. And as historian Thavolia Glimpf reminds us, they were Unionists. The brush of fire set against the structures of local homesteads, or the plot to leave and locate kin, set in motion the political sensibilities of enslaved women and girls who did their part to undermine the seceded states. As the cases of women and girls reveal here, they were not only made their way to Union lines, but most of them left for counties in Virginia in search of family and friends. Freedom began with kinship and the reconstitution of ties that played such a critical part in how they envisioned their new lives. Insurgency came with grave risks and costs, and belonging and freedom, although imperfect, became its sweet rewards. Thank you.
Well, we got to get you out to sign books. You want to know more, you got to buy the book, right? You got to buy the book. We want to thank Dr. Nunley so much for coming up to join us. Thank you so much. Really, Aaron in the back of the room is going to take you back out to the front table to sign.
Thank you for being here. You know, I'm not a Hollywood actor, so I really appreciate you being here today.
For those who want to get a copy of the book, Dr. Nunley will make her way out to the front table through the crowd, and you can get a signed copy there. We'll be back in this room at 3 o'clock, where I will be presenting Fort Sumter to Gettysburg connections, unique connections between the first shots of the Civil War and the biggest battle of the Civil War. In this room, 3 o'clock, okay? Thank you.